Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. We have some very important and very exciting news to report on. A federal judge has condemned the FBI for manufacturing a different, older DT plot. This is a post 9/11 plot, and ordering the release of the final incarcerated Newburgh Four defendants. So let's go ahead and get into that. And then I'm going to read you guys something from Barry Croft, who was framed and entrapped in the FBI's Whitmer Fednapping hoax. As you guys know, I am doing a documentary on that, and I think that you'll find what he has to say very interesting. Here's the article, though, from the Epic Times. Last Newburgh Four prisoner released. Judge says FBI invented conspiracy in post 9/11 plot. Only the government could have made a tea out of Mr. Cromitie, whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean in scope. Hopefully I'm pronouncing Mr. Cromitie's name correctly here, but isn't this interesting? FBI invented conspiracy in post 9/11 plot. Is this sounding familiar, guys? Because it should be. It mirrors exactly sort of the Whitmer case, the Huttery militia case. It's disturbing, okay? A man portrayed by officials as the ringleader, quote unquote, of a T group known as the Newburgh Four has been released from prison after presenting evidence he'd been framed, quote unquote, by the US government. Now, I want to unpack that a little bit. I think it's important because I want to compare and contrast to the Whitmer story. You know, we've got Adam Fox. He was framed as a ringleader in the Whitmer case, a man who is, at the time, homeless and living in the basement of the Vac Shack, and Barry Croft, a 50-year-old middle-aged trucker and father of three from Delaware, who was framed as the other ringleader and, for some reason, the quote-unquote spiritual leader of a conspiracy, quote-unquote, completely fabricated by the FBI that, of course, never happened. But look at this here. This is not fake news. This is not a conspiracy theory. What you're looking at there is he presented evidence that the US government framed him. He, an American citizen. So why would it be controversial to suggest the same thing happened to the men in the Whitmer case? And again, 5 of those men have been acquitted. 5 are appealing right now. And I have major concerns about what is going on with those appeals. I have concerns about some of the appeals lawyers who don't seem to be particularly interested in doing their job. So, let's see here. On Friday, U.S. District Judge Colleen McMahon granted James Cromitie, 58, compassionate release from prison nearly 7 months after she ordered the release of his 3 co-defendants. In her ruling, the judge wrote that Mr. Cromitie and his co-defendants, quote, would not have and could not have devised on their own a crime involving missiles that would have warranted the 25-year sentence the court was forced to impose. Forced to impose. That is very important. And again, you could apply the same thing to the Whitmer case. Adam and Barry are both currently in Florence Supermax. Adam is serving a 16-year sentence. He had no prior criminal record at all, no history of any kind of V, if you know what I mean. And Barry, he had no real issues before either. I mean, he had some things from when he was like a young kid, but that was it. And he's has a 19-year sentence, so he had kind of the highest there, at least out of the federal guys. Some of the guys in the state case that were charged with, quote, providing material support in the Whitmer case could be in there until 2063, which is just absolutely insane. The notion that Mr. Cromitie was selected as a leader by co-defendants is inconceivable given his well-documented buffoonery and ineptitude, she added. Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about Adam Fox in a way. Adam was described by a fellow, according to the government, co-conspirator Ty Garbin, the snitch, as Captain Autism. So he described Adam as Captain Autism and said he did not see Adam as his leader. In fact, many of the guys in the Whitmer case thought that Adam was not on the same level as them. They kind of thought he was that he would run around not holding his firearm properly, or like they felt like he wasn't at the same level as them. Basically, not somebody they would see as a leader at all. And some of them, the group began to splinter when the informant Dan, who basically became the executive officer, the XO, the number two in command of the Wolverine Watchmen, when Dan introduced Adam into the group, there were people who didn't want him there. And this is, one of the reasons the group started to splinter, but the FBI just told the informant Dan to convince everybody that Adam was just like them. Let's see. The attorney for Mr. Cromitie, Carrie Lawrence, told the Epoch Times that although satisfied justice has finally been served, his client should never have been convicted. Quote, "We are very happy he finally has been allowed to go home, and it's been acknowledged that this government's misconduct is largely responsible for warranting his early release. We still believe Mr. Cromitie was wrongfully convicted," and I would say the same of the 5 men convicted in the Whitmer hoax. In the motion filed last September in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, Mr. Lawrence alleged the entire plot had been manufactured by law enforcement. Gee, guys, does that sound familiar? Cromitie had been maneuvered by the government and its informant into committing a crime that had a 25-year minimum sentence, according to the filing. Quote, "It was a crime so beyond Cromitie's capabilities that any objective person would conclude he could not have ever committed it if the government had not framed him by suggesting it, supplying it, and walking Cromitie through every step. The targets, bees, missiles, as well as plans for the mission had all been supplied by a federal informant, Shahid Hussein, who was trying to avoid prison for a fraud case of his own. In the months leading up to the arrest, Mr. Hussein had become known in Newberg for driving a flashy BMW in the poverty-stricken area of New York. In brief, Cromitie, an impoverished small-time hustler, was gulled by the government's informant, Shahid Hussein, to agree to commit horrendous crimes that he never would have even thought of, let alone attempted or committed, if the government had left him alone, the filing added. Quote, "The offenses were heinous but never real, and were made up by the government in every respect. There was never any actual danger," unquote. That is incredibly important because it mirrors the Whitmer case, but the Whitmer case is even worse because they used more than one informant. They used 12 of them, an entire network of them, with undercover FBI agents as well. Online covert employees, operating Facebook accounts, befriending people. It makes me sick, guys. Last year, the other 3 men convicted more than a decade ago in the high-profile post-9/11 sting were ordered to be released from prison by the judge after her ruling that the real conspirator was the United States. Well, if the Whitmer guys were Muslims, somebody would care about them. But even these guys had to spend over 10 years in jail, and it took that long to get their wrongful false convictions overturned. And why have the FBI agents who manufactured this not been criminally charged? They should also be held civilly liable. This is ridiculous. Judge McMahon wrote in her scathing 28-page order that Anta Williams, David Williams, Laguerre Payan were caught up in a scheme driven by overzealous FBI agents and a villain of an informant. And in the Whitmer case, you had 3 FBI agents accused of misconduct, Impala accused of perjury, Jason Chambers, who was operating his own cyber intelligence and private intelligence firm called Exa Intel that was seeking to profit financially from the case, but also he was seeking to leverage his FBI skills to create a profit in the private sector. He was looking to retire very soon, and he was talking about utilizing FBI resources to help this transition to the private sector. He was seeking contracts with state governors for venue security, things of this nature. And gee, if there was a threat on Capitol buildings, maybe the governors would be hiring his company to secure their venues, venue and event monitoring. That's what literally Jason Chambers was doing. Then there was Richard Trask, who was going to be the Bureau's public face of the Whitmer case, who signed off on the criminal complaint that was arrested after attending a swingers party in Kalamazoo and beating, in my opinion, trying to yeet his wife. Okay, this was the agents in the Whitmer case. There were numerous agents that were not just overzealous, they engaged in outright criminal activity, in my opinion. And there was, again, a network of 12 informants, 2 to 3 undercover agents. They utilized these online covert employees. They created an entire fake national militia group. Okay, so it's just 1,000 times worse than the Newburgh Four case. And yet we still haven't gotten these convictions overturned. The FBI invented the conspiracy, identified the targets, manufactured the ordinance, federalized what would otherwise have been a state crime, and picked the day for the mission, Judge McMahon wrote. Well, for the Whitmer case, the FBI invented the conspiracy. They identified the targets. They gave informants access to a database of targets. They manufactured the ordinance. And they basically just framed people. I would say there were elements of entrapment, but it was mainly just framing people, you know, hosting these lavish FTXs, calling these meetings to order, calling and chairing the meetings, inviting targets, trying to get them to say things that were incriminating, providing them refreshments in the form of alcohol and ounces of marijuana, getting them riled up, and then just recording the things that they would say. It's absolutely sickening. The arrest came May 2009 after an FBI operation alleged that the men had been plotting DT attacks on synagogues in and around New York, as well as planning to shoot down National Guard planes. All 4 were sentenced to a mandated minimum of 25 years in federal prison. Imagine that, for, again, something completely fabricated by the FBI. In her July 27 order, Judge McMahon reduced the sentences of 3 of the men to time served plus 90 days. The 4 men targeted by the informant have been described as poor and unsophisticated. One of the 4 suspects, Mr. Payen, who was arrested in a crack house surrounded by bottles of his urine, suffered from severe mental illness. According to the judge, it was later revealed he believed Florida was a foreign country. And this is what the FBI does with your taxpayer dollars. The informant offered to pay medical bills for another one of his targets, David Williams, after learning he had a brother that was fighting cancer. Do you see what they do to people? This is what I mean by they target vulnerable people on the fringes of society that no one cares about, people that don't have the resources to fight back against the world's most powerful government, and then they find their weak points. Oh, you have a brother that has cancer. I can help you if you just do this thing that you never had the idea to do and never would have done. And then they just relentlessly pressure. Mr. Hussein also offered to pay the rent and cover debts for the other men convicted in the case. Oh, you need help paying your rent? Well, do this thing for me. Oh, you have debts? I can take care of that. In addition to supplying all of the bad items, Mr. Hussein offered the men hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, expensive cars, and other incentives for their agreement to help him carry out the FBI's plan, according to the defense. At the trial for Mr. Cromitie, District Judge Colleen McMahon portrayed him as incapable of masterminding the elaborate plot. The government created acts of tea out of his fantasies of bravado and bigotry and then made those come true. Only the government could have made a tea out of Mr. Cromitie. Yeah. Attorneys representing the other men convicted in the case claimed the government's own bias played a role in the scheme. We've always maintained the prosecution was a witch hunt motivated by Islamophobia. Well, I would say that the Whitmer case was also a witch hunt, but rather than being motivated by Islamophobia, it's motivated by ideological biases that the FBI agents have against people who engage in perfectly legal activity. And it's political, purely political. On to David and Laguerre, I guess his name was Laguerre Payen, were destitute when they were targeted and entrapped for their race, religion, and working class backgrounds by a government looking to spread fears and justify bloated budgets. Well, they're doing the same thing, only this time the fear isn't Muslims. The new fear is these so-called RW militias and the quote-unquote extremists that the FBI claims are hiding around every corner, and again for the same reasons. There is no publicly disclosed FBI rule about confidential informants giving gifts to the targets of the investigation. Yeah. Mr. Cromitie was incarcerated at FCI Allenwood, where he served over 14 years of his sentence. Lawrence said Cromitie has a long road ahead in reclaiming the time stolen from him. He will never get that time back. Neither will the men wrongly, falsely framed and convicted in the Whitmer hoax. They'll never get that time back either. He hopes the judge's ruling will set a precedent for the FBI's use of confidential informants in the future. Well, clearly that hasn't happened, because they did this to these men back in 2009. Here we are, 2024. They are still doing the exact same things. And until these actual agents themselves are criminally liable, criminally charged for doing this stuff, there isn't going to be any incentive for them to not do these things. They have every incentive to manufacture this stuff because they get promotions, they get career promotions, they get bonuses, they have financial incentives to do these things. Unless you create a deterrent to them with, hey, you could face jail time if you break the law to frame and entrap people, they have every incentive to keep doing it. He says, we hope the judge's language resonates with the FBI and leads them to change how they handle these undercover operations in the future. No, a judge's language isn't going to help them learn anything. Like, what are you, and they're going to just reform themselves out of the goodness of their own heart after they did something so horrific. No. Here's ABC News. And now I want to bring up also that I have been talking about, and, you know, I kind of have predicted as well as other people, that they were going to run Whitmer for higher office, and part of setting up the whole Whitmer hoax was to try to make her a victim after everything she did during the pandemic, as you all know, and the horrible things she was responsible for. She was just yesterday brought on to do a glowing interview with Face the Nation on CBS, and there's a transcript of it here. I will include the link to this in the video description. You can watch it for yourself, and you can read the transcript. I find it easier and better I digest it better by reading it than watching it, because as soon as she starts talking with that gross, you know, that nasty, snide, condescending voice she has, like, I immediately tune out. I start hearing wah wah wah, you know. And so it's clear they're grooming her for higher office. They may run her as Joe Biden's vice president, because Kamala Harris is so unlikable, and while Whitmer is too, she's a little bit more savvy as far as PR than Kamala Harris, and she doesn't have the same obnoxious cackle. I think Gavin Newsom are being prepared. Now, I want to read, I've got a picture here, by the way, of Barry Crawford when he was in high school. Barry, of course, framed as a ringleader and quote-unquote spiritual leader in the FBI's fake kidnapping case. I want to read a couple things from him here. This comes from Barry's prison notes. He says, how can I be involved in a conspiracy with 5 other people whom I have had minimal contact with? Good question. 2 phone calls with Adam Fox, a total of 15 minutes. No text messages, no instant messages, no encrypted chats. No electronic contact with others. They were strangers to me. Isn't that interesting? Dan and the FBI, well, we'll save that for later. I want to read this part. The government claims the, quote, plot was discovered while investigating the Wolverine Watchmen in March. How come they utilized informants from Tennessee and Wisconsin in January to attempt to weave targeted individuals into a conspiracy that didn't exist? This demonstrates the government's predisposition, and I would suggest that he was right. He says the government was pulling warrants on me, citing 18 U.S. Code Section 371, but wasn't finding illegal activity. So they run informants at me to try to produce activity. Exactly. And then he says, it's obvious the FBI can't be trusted to turn over exculpatory evidence. Can previous instances of that behavior be brought up at our trial? It was a good question, and I don't believe that they were able to do that. Also, can previous cases of the FBI's willingness to commit a crime be cited at our trial, showing their predisposition to create the whole event as a party opponent? Yeah. Who officially initiated the staged event? What office, what agent, and who authorized the targeting? Yeah. These are all great questions. Now, I'm going to read something he wrote called Fear. He says, I have often wondered what human trait produces the most output. Is it greed, want of power, lust of fleshly satisfaction, desperation, or fear? What condition motivates to the most severe extent? Powerful rich men have sacrificed their stature for lust of flesh. Addicts risk their freedom and lives in desperation to get high. Greed and want of power drive politicians to abandon concern for those they claim to serve. And although all the above have led to murder, one results in torment and death more often than any of the others. Fear. In the early formation of America, fear was used to nearly exterminate the native peoples, almost entirely, including women and children. After World War II, fear of the Russians inspired a quote-unquote Cold War. In September of 2001, a tea strike, quote-unquote, motivated fear to epic proportions by taking place on our soil. In all these instances, Americans have seemingly become demoralized and almost insensitive to the deaths or discomforts of others. In all these examples above, various forms of media or public influence was used to drive initiatives against human beings. Facts and truth do not have to be present in these public reportings, as there does not seem to be any accountability placed on the fictions presented that result in the death of others or their severe discomfort. So he's describing here the role that the media plays in convicting people before they've ever been inside the courtroom. He says Webster's New Pocket Dictionary defines tea as, quote, the political use of tea and intimidation. He says, in news broadcasting, if news broadcasting isn't held to reporting the true facts of a subject, they can be wielded as the most effective mode of tea in existence. I think that's a very good point. Anyways, I think that this news on the Newburgh Four is good, but I'd like to see more. We still have, again, these 5 men who have been wrongly convicted in something way worse, who are having their appeals seemingly derailed as we speak. For the guys in the state case, their appeals briefs are due in February. That's 1 month from now. And they still haven't gotten access to all their transcripts. They have no access to a Michigan law library because they got moved to federal facilities across the country outside the state of Michigan, making it also difficult for them to contact their lawyers. The lawyers don't really seem interested in this. It doesn't seem to bother them. They don't seem to care. And for Adam, his appeals brief looks like it was written by a federal prosecutor. It looks like it was written by Nils Kessler himself. It is absolutely disturbing. In fact, I should do a separate video just talking about Adam's appeals brief, because it is not, in my opinion, written by anyone who has any intention to try to fight to get him out. His lawyer is admitting he had a, quote, predisposition because of memes and text messages where he was literally repeating things that these government agents and informants were telling him every single day for months. And again, Dan had told him, Dan Chappell, the FBI informant, one of the lead informants, had told him, oh yeah, when I was in the military, we had to give people a mission to focus on, to keep them focused for training. So it's not real. When we talk about these things, it's just to keep the guys focused. So Adam didn't think it was real. He thought it was like LARPing, but doing it for a good cause, like, oh, this is how in the military they got men focused for training was they would train them for specific missions. And Dan, again, had posed as this Iraq war hero and told him he was part of the elite unit that helped rescue Chris Kyle. Adam is deferring to who he thinks is like an expert. And it's just disgusting. So I'm interested to know, what do you guys think? Do you think that this ruling will have any bearing on these appeals? Do you think it would positively impact them? And what are your thoughts on the case? Read.